hast made my days as an handbreadth, and mine age is as nothing before thee. Verily, every man at his best state is altogether vanity. Selah. Surely, every man walketh in a vain show. Surely they are disquieted in vain. He heapeth up riches, and knoweth not who shall gather them. And now, Lord, what wait I for? My hope is in thee. Deliver me from all my transgressions. Make me not the reproach of the foolish. I was dumb. I opened not my mouth, because thou didst it. Remove thy stroke away from me. I am consumed by the blow of thine hand. When thou with rebukes dost correct man for iniquity, thou makest his beauty to consume away like a moth. Surely every man is vanity. Selah. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear unto my cry. Hold not thy peace at my tears, for I am a stranger with thee, and a sojourner, as all my fathers were. O spare me, that I may recover strength, before I go hence and be no more. Now we see Psalm 39 is, I believe, an addendum or a continuation from Psalm 38. And you may recall, last Wednesday we spoke from Psalm 38. It is a penitential psalm as David is confessing his sin and asking for God's forgiveness. Psalm 39 is given to Jeduthun, who was the leader of one of the choirs, one of the three choirs of the tabernacle. And the purpose for David giving this particular psalm to this Levite would have been to put it to music so that it could be sung in the place of worship. But this is not the typical song of majestic praise and honor and glory to God, but rather it is a somber and serious prayer and a song to God about the frailty of man and about the seriousness of sin. And David is contemplating about the cost or the price of his sin. You know, when we find ourselves in the place of correction before God, when we find that we're being chastised for sin that we've willfully committed against our loving God, we might ask ourselves the question, what do we do? How do we respond? And this is exactly where David finds himself in Psalm 39. And he is here giving us this solemn psalm of contrition and brokenness as he also pleads for restoration by the hand of God. The psalm, for our purposes tonight, is broken into two sections. First of all, we see David silent, and then we see David supplicating. First of all, we note David's silence in the first three verses. You'll take note how David essayed or attempted in verse 1 to be quiet. And I want you to consider with me, first of all, tonight, the benefit of silence. The benefit of silence. David here is characterized as speaking to himself. In verse 1, the first two words, I said. David, speaking to himself, said to himself, I will take heed to my ways. You know, there's many times in your walk and my walk in our Christian life that we find ourselves having a conversation in our head or in our heart. We're musing or thinking about the events of our life, the circumstances that we're facing, perhaps about our relationship with God. And I would say, by the way, it's important and it's helpful to have seasons of silence where we can really be open before God and have the time and space to think, the time and space to reflect. And here David said to himself these words, I will take heed to my ways. Evidently, David had made some error. He had sinned against God in some way, and he realized now his great need to be circumspect, to pay attention to his path, to the steps that he was taking. And in particular, he needed to take heed to his ways in regards to what he might say. And so he said, I will take heed to my ways that I sin not with my tongue. How often you and I sin with our speech. How often we find that our speech is not that which is glorifying to the Lord. And David here characterized himself as being before wicked men, and he said while he was before those wicked men, he would keep his mouth with a bridle. The same type of harness that would be used on a horse to turn it from one way to the other and direct it. David says, I'm going to be making sure that my mouth has a bridle. Oh, sometimes we need to have a bridle or a muzzle upon our mouth. We need to, as I was told on numerous occasions when I was a little boy, zip your lip. Stop talking. Some of you remember that, don't you? That I sin not with my tongue. Sometimes when we're in the presence of wicked men, we're tempted to mimic their ways and their speech. And we ought to be careful about what we say. This is the benefit of silence. David was learning that there's a time to be quiet. God says to us, be still and know that I am God. God tells us that we should be quiet before Him. There's a time, and sometimes when we come to our prayer closet, we're in a hurry to start talking. And maybe what we need to do first is just be quiet before the Lord. Before we start telling God what's on our mind, perhaps we should find out what's on God's mind. You say, pray tell, how would I find such a thing? He's revealed His mind to us in His Word. And if we would be quiet before Him with an open Bible, we might have the experience of the benefit of silence. But then it crossed over from the benefit of silence to the burden of silence. Because now David was not just being silent before men. It wasn't just that he was being careful not to sin with his speech. But in verse number 2, he characterizes himself as being dumb with silence. Now that doesn't mean he was stupid. It means that he had no words. He had nothing that he could say. David here is stating that his silence extended even to speaking that which was good. He goes on and he says, I held my peace even from good. Now it's good for us to be silent and not to sin with our mouth. But David moved from the place of guarding against the sin of commission, committing sin with his tongue, to now being involved in the sin of omission. Oh, it was good for him not to say some things, but you know, at the same time, there are some things that we ought to say. There are some good things that we should direct to the Lord. Praise and confession and these sorts of things. And David realized that now he was in a place where he was holding his peace even from that which is good. So it was good for him to be silent, but now it's gone too far. And he says in verse 2, and my sorrow was stirred. Within his heart, David was stirred up. He could have been using good and godly speech that could have encouraged and helped him, but instead he was dumb with silence, and the net result of his silence was that his heart became filled with sorrow, and his heart began to burn within him. Like Jeremiah, who said, I will be silent, I will not speak. And the more that he was quiet, the more that God's word burned within his heart until he could no longer keep silence. David determined he could not keep silence as a child of God. And in verse number 3, he says, my heart was hot within me. While I was musing, the fire burned. Then spake I with my tongue. Suddenly, David gives vent. He gives voice to the thoughts that were on his heart. The more that he thought and meditated, the more his heart burned within him, and he came to the place that he must speak, and so he speaks to God. So he had a season of silence, but now in the balance of the psalm, we see David in the place of supplication. We see David crying out to the Lord from verses 4 through 13. By the way, it is wise that when David's heart burned within him, he found that he must speak to the Lord. There's great value in making our request known to the Lord. Sometimes discouragement and disappointment will try to drive us from the place of prayer, but we must not yield to this temptation. We must be careful that we give voice to the thoughts and to the burdens of our heart, that we bring them to the place, the only place where we can find solace and comfort and help, the very throne of God, which is opened up to us as the children of God. In verses 4 and 5, we find David framing his request to the Lord. And first of all, he requested, or he asked God to show him how fragile his life was. Did you note the descriptive phrases that are used in verse 4 and 5? Lord, make me to know mine end. Not many people like to think about their end. The end is the border, the extremity. It's the final place. Do you realize tonight that you have an end? And for some of us, the end is in sight. For some folks, you think, well, I know that it's close. For others, you may say, it seemed not so long ago like my end was a long ways away, but it's gotten closer a lot faster than I thought it would. But David here has a curious request. He says, Lord, make me to know mine end. God, remind me that my physical life has a conclusion. It has an end. Many people today are living as if they will always live. They're living as if they will never die. They're living as if they're going to be in this same place, in this same body for thousands of years. And yet the truth of the matter is that 100 years from now, it's doubtful that there will be any of us left on this earth. And he says, Lord, teach me to know mine end. Make me know that my life is brief. He goes on this same theme in verse 4. He says, make me to know the measure of my days, what it is. The word measure that's used here in the text in verse 4 refers to the way that a tailor might size up a garment. He might measure it out to cut it and to make it fit a particular individual. And you know, God doesn't give any of us a guarantee of a certain number of years, and different people's lives will be different lengths. And David says this to the Lord, show me or make me to know the measure of my days. Do you know tonight, God has numbered your days. He's measured them. They're already set. He knows exactly how many days you have left. That might be depressing to you, but that's exciting to me. To know that I have a sovereign God who loves me and cares about me, and He knows exactly how long I'll be around. He knows the measure of my days. He goes on in verse 4, that I may know how frail I am. Now, we don't like using that word frail about ourselves. That word frail means that we are transient. It means we're just passing through. It means that we are full of weakness. We like to accentuate our strength. We like to talk about how able we are and how strong we are and how capable we are. And David says, God, show me how frail I am. Do you know, for all the things that man can do, there's a lot of things that man can't do. For all the ingenuity and wisdom and intellect of man, there's a lot of limits, aren't there? And we run up against those limits often. David said, God, show me how frail I am. But sometimes we're told, if we have enough time and enough money, we can solve any problem. That's not necessarily true, because there are lots of problems that time and money will never solve. Time and money will never take care of, because we are frail, we are weak. He goes on in verse 5 and he says, behold, thou hast made my days as an handbreadth. Now, different men have a different handbreadth It was a way of measuring a space. Oftentimes it would be measured with the king's handbreadth. And that would be an official measurement. But, I mean, if you just hold your hand up and look at it and think, that's my life, that doesn't look too long, does it? It seems as if you can see that in a glance. It seems as if in just a moment of time, it's here and gone. And he says, God, you've measured my days out, and my days are just in handbreadth. How quickly life passes. How short the days are. In the scope of eternity, we could lay out our entire life as nothing more than a handbreadth. Just a short space of time. Mine age is as nothing. In the eyes of God, David's days of his life were fleeting and short. Mine age is as nothing. It's just like God, who is eternal, and of course, God, who is existing in the past, present, and future all at the same time, is not at all impressed with our longevity. And so, you know, when somebody lives to be 115 or 120 years old, it hits the newspaper. People think, look at this person who lived, and it is remarkable when someone lives that long, because we realize most of us aren't going to live that long. If somebody lives that long and we celebrate that and we think, isn't that wonderful? And to God, 120 years, that's nothing. That's a drop in the bucket to the eternal God. And David said, my days are like nothing before you, Lord. Every man at his best state, he says in verse 5, is altogether vanity. Chew on that a while. In your most productive, the strongest season of your life, the time of your greatest intellect and accomplishment, here's what God says: you in your best state are nothing more than emptiness, vanity, worthlessness. Now, some people take exception to these kinds of phrases and they say, hey, I thought man was important to God. Well, he is, but only by God's declaration. Not because of something we offer to him, but simply by his decree and his declaration that we are a special creation of God, and that makes us special. It's not as if we're coming to God saying, look at what I can offer to you. We're empty. When we tend to rejoice in our strength and in the days of our strength, but how quickly they fly away. And by the way, how empty of real purpose they often are. Many people take the years of their strength and they waste them. They fritter them away in silly pursuits that are temporal, that have nothing to do with eternity or with their relationship with God. And one day they'll look back on those things and they'll think, well, that was stupid. That was a waste of my strength. Man tends to use his strength for vain and empty purposes that will be worthless in eternity. That word vain, you could read that selfish. After all, men are out for themselves. They're out to get what they want. They're out to fill their life full of purpose. We have our bucket lists. We have our dreams. We have our goals. We have the things that we want to achieve. We've decided that if we could, at the time of our death, live in a 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom house on 5 acres and drive a Rolls Royce, we would be really happy. And God says it's vanity. It's emptiness. Now notice at the end of verse 5, here's what David puts for us, this little word, Selah. Stop right there and think. Pause and meditate. Chew on the words, the phrases that go before this, and think about what it is that draws us to sin. It's our selfishness. It's our wrong valuation of that which is really important. And this is why we need to take the time to meditate on those previous truths that are spelled out in verses 4 and 5. But not only did David ask God to show him how fragile his life was, second of all, in his supplication, David begins to expound on this theme of recognizing the worthlessness of what most men live for. It's worthless. In verse 6, he says, "Surely every man walketh in a vain show. Surely they are disquieted in vain. He heapeth up riches, and knoweth not who shall gather with him." Now, think along with the psalmist here. A vain show. A vain show is an illusion. It's something that looks real, but it's not real. You know, many people are living an illusion. They're pretending that the life they're living is of utmost importance and value when really it's not. Really, their life is worthless in the scope of eternity. They're so focused on mowing the lawn, making sure that the house is painted, getting the car waxed, being successful at their career, making sure that they get lots of things accumulated in the bank and in their portfolio, and they live and live and live for all these things. And it's a vain show. Now, in and of themselves, there's nothing wrong with these things. There's nothing wrong with mowing the grass. Your neighbors will probably appreciate it. There's nothing wrong with waxing your car. There's nothing wrong with working a job God made us to work. There's not even anything wrong with preparing for the future as long as we keep it in perspective. As long as we understand that in the scope of eternity, it's nothing, it's vanity. In verse 6, he says, "Surely they are disquieted in vain." That word "surely" is like when Jesus said, "Verily, verily." Pay attention. This is really important. Surely they are disquieted in vain. That word disquieted means to get stirred up, to get excited. We could be excited either to joy or to anger. But the things that disquiet us are often things of little or no eternal value. Let me give you an example. Go to your typical sporting event. Let's pick something. A hockey game, a basketball game, a baseball game. I enjoy sports. But while you're there, just sit and listen to the people around you. So here comes, well, we went to a hockey game not too long ago, so I'll use this as an example. Here comes the person coming down, and he's got the puck, and he's skating and weaving, and he slaps the shot, and and he misses. And the people behind you, "What are you doing, you idiot? Don't you know how to shoot? What is wrong with you?" Here's what I'm thinking. I can't even stand up on skates. I would be falling down. I'm impressed that this person just swung